You know, there's something about old British homes that carries weight. Not just history, but presence. The kind that settles into walls and floorboards, waiting. I'm Marco, just an Italian-American guy who can't get enough of Europe's darker corners, the stories that don't make tourist brochures. Tonight's tale comes from Manchester, England, a city that wears its industrial past like a scar, beautiful and brutal all at once. This happened in 2017 to a family I'll call the Harpers. What started as small oddities in their kitchen became something that would drive them from their home and leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about the world. Before we dive in, let me give you some context about British housing, particularly in the north. Manchester's residential areas are filled with Victorian and Edwardian terraced houses, rows of homes sharing walls, built during the city's industrial boom to house factory workers. These aren't mansions. They're modest, practical structures where generations lived, worked, died. The walls absorbed it all. Sarah Harper was 34, a primary school teacher with a practical mind. Her husband James worked in IT, equally grounded in logic and routine. Their two daughters, Emma, age 9, and Sophie, age 6, completed the picture of an ordinary British family living an ordinary life in a 3-bedroom terraced house in Chorlton, a neighborhood known more for its cafes and parks than paranormal activity. They bought the house in early 2017. It needed work, the usual stuff with houses that age. New boiler, updated wiring, fresh paint. But structurally, it was sound, and the price was right. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Ashworth, had lived there for 43 years before moving into care. The estate agent mentioned she'd been reluctant to leave, kept saying she needed to keep things in order. But they'd chalk that up to the confusion of old age. The kitchen was at the back of the house, a narrow galley-style room typical of these Victorian builds. Original features remained, the old cast-iron range now decorative, the stone sink replaced, but the deep windowsill intact. Sarah loved it immediately, saw potential in the worn wooden counters and the way afternoon light came through the back window. The incidents started small, so small that for weeks they dismissed them as simple forgetfulness. Sarah would place her car keys on the counter by the kettle before bed, a habit so ingrained she didn't even think about it anymore. But 3 mornings in a row, she found them on the opposite counter by the bread bin. She asked James if he'd moved them. He hadn't touched them. Maybe Emma playing around. But Emma never went into the kitchen that early, was always the last one up. Then it was James's wallet. He kept it in the same spot every night, on the small table by the back door. Twice in 1 week, he found it inside the cupboard above the fridge. Not fallen in accidentally, but placed there deliberately, standing upright between the cereal boxes. When you live with kids, you get used to things being moved, misplaced, ending up in strange spots. So they laughed it off initially, Emma blaming Sophie, Sophie blaming Emma, both probably innocent. Life's chaos with children. Things go missing. That's just how it is. But the pattern persisted, and it was always the kitchen, never anywhere else in the house, and always overnight. Sarah started paying closer attention. She began placing items in specific spots before bed and photographing them with her phone, timestamps included, a small notebook by the toaster, a wooden spoon in the utensil jar, the kettle facing a particular direction. She didn't tell James at first, didn't want him thinking she was losing it. Every morning, something had changed. The notebook moved from counter to windowsill. The spoon relocated from the jar to the drying rack. The kettle rotated 180 degrees. Small movements, but deliberate. Nothing fell or knocked over. Everything carefully repositioned. She showed James the photos after a week of documentation. He looked at the timestamps, the clear evidence that items moved between midnight and 6 a.m. when everyone was asleep. His practical mind struggled with it. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe they were both moving things while half asleep, some kind of sleepwalking neither remembered. But both of them? Simultaneously? Every night? They decided to stay awake one night and watch. Sitting in the darkened living room with a clear view through to the kitchen, they waited. James dozed off around 2 a.m. despite his best efforts. Sarah made it until 3:30 before exhaustion won. When they woke at dawn, stiff and cold on the sofa, they checked the kitchen. The salt and pepper shakers had swapped positions. The tea towel hung on a different hook. The magnetic shopping list on the fridge had moved 6 inches to the left. That's when the fear really started settling in. Because if they hadn't done it, and the girls were asleep upstairs, then what had? Sarah called her sister, Margaret, who lived in Leeds. Margaret was the opposite of Sarah, believed in crystals and energy and all the New Age stuff Sarah had always dismissed. But Sarah was desperate for any explanation that made sense. Margaret drove down that weekend. She walked through the house slowly, stopping longest in the kitchen. She stood in the center of the room, eyes closed, for what felt like forever while Sarah watched, embarrassed and hopeful in equal measure. "There's something here," Margaret said finally. Someone. Not malevolent, I don't think, but stubborn. Set in their ways, this was their space. Sarah wanted to roll her eyes, but couldn't quite manage it. "What do you mean?" "Whoever lived here before. This kitchen was important to them. It was their domain. They had a routine, a system, everything in its place. And they're still trying to maintain that order." Mrs. Ashworth. It had to be connected to her. Sarah tracked down Mrs. Ashworth's daughter through the estate agent. The woman, Helen, agreed to meet at a local cafe. She was in her 60s, tired-looking, carrying the weight of having recently placed her mother in care. When Sarah explained the situation, carefully, trying not to sound insane, Helen's face changed. Recognition, then something like relief. "She talked about it constantly," Helen said quietly. "Near the end, before the dementia got really bad. She'd say she needed to go home, needed to keep the kitchen right. We thought it was just confusion, but she was so specific. Said if things weren't in their proper places, something terrible would happen. We had to practically drag her out when we moved her." "Did anything happen there? In the house, I mean. Before?" Helen stirred her tea slowly. "My father died in that kitchen. Heart attack right by the sink. Mom found him in the morning. This was 1985. She never really recovered. Spent the next 30 years making sure everything stayed exactly as he'd left it. She believed if she maintained the order, kept everything in its place, he'd somehow still be there with her." Sarah felt cold. "Did she ever mention things moving?" "No. But she talked about feeling him there, watching, making sure she kept house properly. We thought it was grief, maybe early dementia. Now I'm not so sure." Back home, Sarah tried to find patterns in the movements. Which items moved most often? Where did they end up? She mapped it out over 2 weeks, creating a bizarre diagram of kitchen reorganization. What emerged was disturbing. The items weren't moving randomly. They were being placed in older positions, locations that existed before Sarah's renovations. The kettle kept moving to where the old electric one had sat, visible in photos from the estate listing. Keys ended up where a key hook had once hung, the nail holes still visible in the plaster. The spoon jar kept migrating to a spot where, Sarah discovered from old photos Helen provided, Mrs. Ashworth had kept her utensils for decades. The house was trying to reset itself to a previous state. Or someone was. James suggested they respect it. Stop fighting the movements. Let the kitchen be arranged how it wanted. Maybe that would satisfy whatever was causing this, and it would stop. So they tried. They placed items where they kept getting moved to, rearranged the counter space to match old photographs, even bought an old-fashioned kettle similar to the one Mrs. Ashworth had used. For 3 nights, nothing moved. The kitchen stayed exactly as they'd left it. Sarah almost relaxed. Maybe Margaret had been right. Maybe this was just residual energy, a ghost of routine that needed acknowledgement. On the 4th night, everything escalated. Sarah woke to sound. Not loud, but distinct enough to pull her from sleep. A rhythmic tapping, metal on metal. She checked the clock, 3:17 a.m. Beside her, James, slept heavily, snoring slightly. The sound came from downstairs, from the kitchen. Every rational part of her brain screamed to wake James, to not go down alone. But her body moved on autopilot, drawn by something between curiosity and compulsion. She crept down the stairs, each step creaking in the old house's particular way. The kitchen door stood half open. Through the gap, she could see the overhead light was on, casting harsh white light across the counters. But she'd turned that light off before bed. She always did. Sarah pushed the door wider. The kitchen looked normal at first glance. Then she noticed the chairs. All 4 dining chairs had been pulled out from the table, positioned around the room like someone had been cleaning underneath. But it was the counter that stopped her breath. Every single item, every utensil, appliance, container had been arranged in a perfect line across the workspace. Kettle, toaster, knife block, salt, pepper, sugar, tea caddy, cookbook, dish soap, sponge, on in precise order. Not how Sarah organized things, not how she would ever organize things, but with clear intention, clear purpose. And in the center of the table sat Mrs. Ashworth's old teapot, the one Helen had given Sarah when she'd mentioned the moving objects, thinking it might help. A 1950s floral china pot that Sarah had packed away in the attic because she preferred her modern electric kettle. It sat on the table now, lid beside it, steam rising gently from the spout. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway. The teapot hadn't been touched in weeks. The attic was locked. She watched the steam curl upward in the cold kitchen air and understood with absolute clarity that she was not alone. She should have run. Every horror film, every ghost story, every instinct said run. But instead, Sarah found herself speaking. "Mrs. Ashworth?" The light flickered once. The house settled around her with its usual creaks and pops, suddenly sounding less random and more like a response. "I know this was your home," Sarah continued, voice shaking. "I know you loved it here. But we live here now, my family. We're trying to respect your space, but we need you to let us live here." Nothing moved. The steam continued rising from the teapot. "We're not trying to erase you, but you can't stay here forever. You have to let go." The light flickered again, longer this time. And then the teapot lid lifted slightly, rattled against the pot's rim, and settled back into place. Once, twice, 3 times. It was the most deliberate, intentional movement Sarah had ever witnessed. Not a draft, not settling, a response. The light went out completely. The kitchen plunged into darkness. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she thought she might vomit. She reached for the light switch, hands fumbling against the wall. When the light came back on, the chairs had been pushed back under the table. The items on the counter remained in their strange line, but the teapot was gone. Vanished? Sarah checked the table, the floor, everywhere. It had simply disappeared. She ran upstairs, woke James, dragged him down to show him. He saw the arranged items, believed her about the teapot, but clearly thought she'd dreamed the rest. How could she blame him? She barely believed it herself. They didn't sleep the rest of that night. Sat in the living room with every light on, watching the kitchen doorway until dawn. The next morning, Sarah called Helen again, told her everything, including the teapot's disappearance. Helen was quiet for a long moment. "That was her favorite," she finally said. "My father gave it to her on their wedding anniversary. She used it every single day until she couldn't manage anymore. Made her tea in it, same time every morning, 6:30 a.m. sharp for 32 years. I think she took it back. Maybe she needed it where she's going." Sarah didn't know what that meant, but something about Helen's tone suggested this might be an ending rather than an escalation. She was right. After that night, the movement stopped completely. Keys stayed where Sarah put them. The kettle didn't rotate. Nothing relocated overnight. The kitchen remained exactly as they left it, morning after morning, week after week. But there was one more incident. 2 months later, Sarah was cleaning out the attic, finally brave enough to go up there after everything that had happened. Tucked in a corner behind old Christmas decorations, she found something wrapped in newspaper from 1985. The teapot. She unwrapped it carefully, hands shaking. It looked exactly as she remembered, the same floral pattern, the same chip on the spout. But inside, folded carefully, was a piece of paper. Old, yellowed, covered in shaky handwriting. It was a note from Mr. Ashworth to his wife. A love letter written on their 25th anniversary, dated 2 weeks before he died. It talked about their life together in that house, raising their family, the kitchen where they'd shared thousands of meals and conversations. It ended with a line that made Sarah cry. "Every morning I wake up grateful to see you there, making tea in this old pot, keeping our home running. You are the heart of this house, always will be." Sarah kept the note, had it framed, hung it in the kitchen where Mrs. Ashworth might have seen it every day. They lived in that house for 2 more years before James got a job transfer to Bristol. In that time, nothing paranormal happened. But Sarah always felt watched in the kitchen, always felt like she was sharing the space with someone who'd loved it first. When they moved out, Sarah left the framed note for the next owners with a letter explaining its significance. She didn't mention the moving objects, didn't want to scare them away or sound crazy, but she hoped they'd understand that sometimes a house carries more than just memories. Sometimes it carries love so strong it refuses to leave. The realtor called a few months later, said the new owners had questions about the note, wanted Sarah's contact information. She never called them back. Some stories are better left with the people who lived them. What happened in that Manchester kitchen? I've thought about it a lot since Sarah shared her story with me at a European paranormal conference last year. In British folklore, there's a concept of residual hauntings, energy imprints left by intense emotion or routine. Mrs. Ashworth had loved that kitchen, had maintained it obsessively for decades, had believed her husband's spirit remained there with her. That kind of devotion, that kind of daily ritual repeated for years, it leaves a mark. Maybe the movements weren't Mrs. Ashworth's ghost at all, but the house itself remembering how things should be. Replaying 30 years of careful placement and order. Or maybe she really was there, unable to let go even after her body gave out. Still trying to keep everything perfect for the husband who never came home from work one morning in 1985. The teapot's disappearance and reappearance, the way it ended after Sarah found the love letter, it suggests something more conscious than residual energy. Something that needed acknowledgement, validation, permission to finally rest. What I find most fascinating is that the haunting, if we call it that, wasn't malevolent. Nothing broken. No one hurt. Just an old woman's ghost rearranging her kitchen every night, maintaining the order she'd kept for decades, unable to comprehend that her time there had ended. There's something heartbreaking about that. The idea that love and routine could be so strong they outlast death itself. That a simple kitchen could matter so much to someone that they'd refuse to leave even when their body failed them. British homes, particularly these old terraced houses in industrial cities, they've absorbed generations of life. Birth, death, love, loss, all soaked into the bricks and mortar. Most of the time it's dormant, unnoticed. But sometimes, when someone loved a place deeply enough, when they poured years of devotion into maintaining it, something remains. Sarah still thinks about that kitchen sometimes. Wonders if the teapot is still in the attic of her old house, or if it finally went wherever Mrs. Ashworth is now. Wonders if the new owners have experienced anything strange, or if the presence finally found peace. She told me she's grateful for the experience, despite the fear. It taught her something about love and letting go, about how the places we call home become part of us and we become part of them. How the boundaries between people and places blur over time until they're inseparable. That's the thing about European ghost stories that American ones often miss. They're rarely about evil or terror. They're about people who loved so deeply they couldn't leave. About places that held on to their inhabitants even after death. About the weight of history pressing down through generations. Mrs. Ashworth spent 32 years keeping her kitchen perfect for a husband who was gone. and even death didn't stop her routine. There's horror in that, yes, but also something profoundly human. The refusal to accept loss, the desperate attempt to maintain normalcy in the face of unbearable grief. If you ever find yourself in an old British home and things start moving on their own, pay attention to the pattern. Sometimes it's not a haunting in the traditional sense. Sometimes it's just someone who loved their home so much they forgot how to leave. And maybe, if you're kind, if you acknowledge their presence and their pain, they'll finally find the peace they couldn't find in life. Thanks for listening to another story from across the Atlantic. Until next time, pay attention to the homes you live in. They remember more than you think.